had 4.5 million years longer than we have to do the same thing.
Right. Great point. Well, Scott, we should clarify, because you mentioned Gigantopithecus blacki. I think the bottom line here is that the lines of paleoanthropology are very blurred, but I guess the listeners should be aware of the fact that they have found fossils of essentially, as you suggested, very large bipedal apes dating back millions of years. So I guess those are the best candidates for these modern reports of things like Bigfoot and the Yeti, would you say?
Well, and uniformly on all continents there have been legends about red-haired giants that existed, and I have been attempting on numerous occasions to get a hold of a tooth or some sample from one of these skulls and skeletons that's been discovered in order to have DNA done on them. And every single time I do, the government grabs it away from me and says, can't get it, can't touch it. So I'm trying to find one in a private collection now that they can't do that to me. So the government apparently knows something they don't want us to know about these animals, which we know exist, or these human-type animals that existed, that we know exist because there are relics in some of the museums of these things, but they will not let you test them.
Pretty remarkable stuff. Scott, you of course heard about Oxford University getting involved in the sense that they're willing to look at different hairs and other DNA, physical evidence.
Well, Adam
that people
Davies
might be able
has
to
been doing
produce.
some wonderful work on the orang pendek of the Southeast
Sumatra.
Asia,
Sumatra,
and that's great because actually the hair samples that he's brought back are related to the orangutan, but they're not orangutan hairs, according to Oxford and the laboratories that have tested it. Now, that's interesting because guess what is the only surviving ape species, great ape species, from the lineage that I'm proposing with the Oreopithecus and the Gigantopithecus blacki?
Well, it's got to be the orang.
You got it.
Wow.
So they're saying it's similar to, but it is not identical to. So that tends to mean that, or tends to support my hypothesis.
Well, that does make a lot of sense. And I think someone in the chat room earlier was also mentioning Flores man, and you know how that might tie into things like the orang pendek and the little hairy duende creatures that I've investigated in Central America.
Sure, and there's similar legends all over the Indian Ocean basin and into Central Africa about these Takalushi. I think is one of them, and then you've got the Ibugogo and a boatload of them that are all these little diminutive animals. But that could also be island effect working on a species, and there's still some equivocation about where Homo floresensis fits into the evolution of man, or if it actually does.
Yeah, I know it's still very recent and very controversial. But if nothing else, it illustrates that some of our relatives, if you will, in the human evolutionary tree, perhaps survived far longer than we at first realized. Which I think
that's
bodes
true,
very well.
And it's entirely possible. Although I know the religious community doesn't want to hear this, and the scientific community is dead set on we're the supreme being on the planet Earth. But it may still be true that there are human relatives and human relations running around that are not Homo sapiens, or should I say Homo sapiens sapiens.
That is a pretty remarkable notion that we do share our planet with some type of distant relatives, and for those of us that are immersed in the field, I think it's actually a very promising possibility.
Well, and this is where we got a nice little segue into our UFO audience, too, because if you listen to people like Eric von Daniken, the human race as we know it was designed as a slave race by extraterrestrials. So what would they start with? About Bigfoot.
Wow. Well, Bigfoot would be an excellent slave, I would think. He could do a lot of heavy lifting, if nothing else. So.
If you made a couple of tweaks to the genetic code so they turned out more like us, of course. And, I mean, even the guy that actually discovered DNA started thinking along those terms, and he won a Nobel Prize. So it's that's called panspermia, is that theory, and that human life and the genetics that make us up evolved elsewhere in the universe and was deposited here somehow. The somehow not being clearly defined.
Well, certainly anything is possible, I suppose, and there are many people that have pointed to those theories. We're going to be taking a break here in a few minutes, Scott, but I'd like to go ahead and get into another of the major cryptid categories, which is the water monsters.
Oh boy, we got plenty of them down here.
Sea serpents and lake monsters. Of course, most people are familiar with the Loch Ness Monster and reports of sea serpents and Champ, or the Lake Champlain Monster. Scott, did you realize we were just a few days away from the 35th anniversary of the Sandra Monsey photograph? That happened on July 6th,
actually. That's a surprise.
July 6, 1977. Tell us about the Monsey photograph, this alleged photograph of a lake monster that was taken.
Well, you're actually going to have to do all of that because I'm not even that familiar with it.
Oh, gosh. Didn't mean to set you up. Basically, a housewife from New York named Sandra Monsey, she and her family were vacationing around Lake Champlain in Vermont back in 1977, and they pulled over at a scenic point to kind of take a look at the lake. And she claims that this basically dinosaur-looking type creature came out of the water, something with a very small head and a long neck, very similar, I suppose, to a plesiosaur or something along those lines. And, of course, her family panicked and scrambled off, but before they did so, she managed to snap a photograph of it. And it is a very controversial piece of film, but I guess most cryptozoologists regard it as the best physical evidence that we have that there could potentially be some type of surviving relic reptile or whatever you want to call it in some of these lakes, like Lake Champlain, Lake Okanagan, and so forth. So
we'll talk about that after the break because we've got a similar story down here in Florida that that appears in my book, and that will be a kind of a fun discussion.
Okay, well, I suppose we're at a good stopping point then. So we're, once again, this is Ken Gerhard with special guest Scott Marlowe on Epic Voyages Radio, and we are going to break for just a couple of minutes here for some commercial announcements. We'll be right back with some more fascinating discussion on the field of cryptozoology. All right, welcome back, everyone, to Epic Voyagers Radio. I am your guest host for this evening, Ken Gerhard, along with cryptozoologist Scott Marlowe from Florida, and we are discussing all types and a manner of mysterious and legendary creatures and weird beasts. And in the last half of the show here, we're going to open it up a little bit to the chat room. If any of you have questions and you'd like to call in and talk to our guest, he's very knowledgeable. The number is 818-919-2355. Again, 818-919-2355 if you have a question for our guest. And Scott, right before we broke for commercial, we were talking about lake monsters, and you actually had some interesting information to share with regard to your home state of Florida and lake monsters. What is that?
Well, back in the 60s, it was the early to mid-60s, we had an attack by a supposed plesiosaur-type sea monster outside of Pensacola, and 4 young men died as a result of that attack. There was one survivor. And the survivor is apparently still alive, but he's been interviewed once. I think it was Argosy did an article, and that's when they released the sea monster story. But up till then, I did the research in the newspaper archives up there, which unfortunately were not on the internet. So I had to spend a week up there digging through old newspaper archives on microfilm to find the entire story in the news, and they never once mentioned a sea monster in any of the news stories. But in any event, the young gentleman by the name of McCleary reported that they were attacked by an animal with a telephone pole-like head that had a turtle-like head on top of it with teeth, and that's what killed his friends. One body was recovered, and it turned out that it was a drowning, and the other 3 were never found. So wow. That's an interesting story. I have not yet done that one for TV, although I suspect that's coming sooner or later. But to kind of get the audience acquainted, I'm sure you all remember the story of the young girl, the surfer, that had been attacked by a bull shark up there and had her arm ripped off.
Gosh, tragic.
That was virtually in the same area that this attack supposedly occurred, and it's quite common to have shark attacks up there. So, could it have been a shark and not a plesiosaur-like animal? And for all of you people out there that are paleontology buffs, yes, I'm well aware the plesiosaur is not in the fossil record here. That's Eurasia. Over here, it would be an elasmosaur, and it had a much longer head than a bulbous head. So yeah, I'm aware of that. So let's not get everybody dialing madly saying, "Oh no, you're wrong." I've had too much of that crap on the internet. In any case, and there are similar animals along here. We've got one on the St. Johns River that's supposedly named Pinky because it has a pinkish tint to its skin. That hasn't been seen in God knows how many years. And I just did a new segment for a PBS series called Weird Florida, and this new one is going to be called On the Road Again, with Charlie Carlson as the host, who's also one of our Pangea Fellows. And I got to talk about a sea serpent or a lake serpent that is probably is a serpent and not a dinosauria type animal. In Lake Clinch, which is only about 20 miles from my home, that took place back in 1926, just before the big bad hurricane blew through here in 26. And again, a gentleman was killed, but was reported because of the hurricane, and they didn't do forensics like they do now. Back then, that was just an accidental drowning, but no one ever explained these strange puncture marks all over the guy's upper torso and near his head, which suspiciously, based on the descriptions that appeared in some diaries of the individuals that recorded it back in those days that I found in the Historical Society, resemble from the descriptions bite marks from a giant green anaconda.
Oh my gosh. Scott, you just laid out a bunch of reasons why I don't go swimming in the ocean.
Well, that was a lake. That wasn't the ocean. But look, on the good side, I can relate a good one. You'll remember that Monster Quest and a bunch of the websites were bombarded by a guy named Sourwine who had sea monster, in quotes, film footage that he had taken in Lake Worth outside of Palm Beach. Monster Quest asked me to take a look at it. And I suggested that we have Ed Batuk, who's a marine biologist, in addition to his other 5 notable PhDs, look at the film too. And we both determined from the footage, and actually only one frame out of 40 hours of footage, that the animal that they were seeing was actually composited. It was manatees that we have down here normally, but that there was a seal swimming with the manatees that had migrated here from up north. Well, we know our manatees go all the way up to Lake Champlain, and have been seen and documented there, and that's within the seal's range. So the seal just followed them down here on the Gulf Stream, and of course the Gulf Stream butts into Lake Worth right at about that location, so that's where it deposited this group. So he's been seen a few times since, but in any event, nobody believed us, including Florida Fish and Wildlife, which had a fit at the thought they were going to have to take care of another exotic. We got hate mail and all kinds of stuff, but it turned out after a News 5 helicopter filmed it from the air that we were right, despite all of the, you're wrong, it couldn't possibly be a seal, yada, 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 that we got for weeks after this thing finally aired on Monster Quest. But, so there are some benign species out there. And, of course, there was no reason in the world why the two animals wouldn't cohabitate, because the manatees are vegans and the seals are carnivores, so they don't even eat the same thing.
Well, that's fascinating. And that, you just made a great point about, sometimes in the field of cryptozoology, it's not about discovering something remarkable like a plesiosaur. It's about finding the truth. And in this case, you identified the species. It was an out-of-place animal and therefore somewhat mysterious. But excellent job on that episode. That was definitely one of the best ones.
Well, but most of the time, these things do turn out to be known animals that are just out of their location. So when I say mystery animals, I kind of like that term better now than I like cryptozoology, because it's become such a pseudoscience in the eyes of the mainstream. But basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to make a determination of what people are seeing. We don't start with the assumption that it's a hoax. We don't start with the assumption that people don't know what they're talking about and are seeing things and having delusions. We start with, well, somebody saw something. Now we got to figure out what it was.
Yep, absolutely. Scott, we have an excellent question from one of the folks in the chat room. Jade Starr has asked, what cryptid do you think will be the next one verified? What do you think has the best chance of discovery at this point in the near future?
Well, I suspect that, of course, let's go with three categories. Let's look at, while we're on the subject of marine cryptids, let's talk about a marine cryptid. I suspect that we will resolve the issue of the megalodon and whether or not it still exists.
Giant shark.
Yes.
Enormous shark, right?
Yeah, and of course the paleontologists have told us that this shark is 60 feet long, as big as a school bus, yada, yada, yada.
Wow.
But there are some paleontologists who are saying the reconstructions of the jaw from which the size estimate was done is incorrect, and the animal is actually a bit smaller and closer to 40 feet, which is within the range of sharks today. They also say that they're related to great white sharks based on the tooth enamel, which we've examined, and I've talked to Ed Patuk and several others about this. It is not related to the great white, even though the tooth is somewhat similarly shaped. If you look at the dentition on the tooth, it is more closely related to the tiger shark than it is the great white. So, this
still wouldn't want to meet a 40-foot shark, though, Scott. I don't know if I want to discover that one.
I hate to tell you, but down in Key Biscayne, I've met a 40-foot shark. We were out on a cabin cruiser that was about 35 feet doing some deep-sea fishing, and we had a 40-footer dogging us all day long, so we couldn't catch a damn thing. That was when I was a youngster, and it scared the bejesus out of me. It really was longer than the boat. And unfortunately, we also that day, as is common in Key Biscayne, because Charlie just had this problem filming for his show, we wound up with 40-foot swells out there in the ocean too. So the boat's just, and I shouldn't be saying this while I'm having a beer, but I don't think I've ever been that seasick. So there's one. As far as avian animals are concerned, I think we'll come up with a solution to the rods and cones thing. And possibly your Thunderbird legend.
Well, we can hope.
Yeah. And
backtrack. You were talking about you mentioned the rods. So clarify this for people that this kind of crosses over into some of the ufology stuff. These are
these
flying objects.
Rods, which I kind of sort of think is some other flying insect that's being mistaken because of the motion blur for something else. It's probably dragonflies or something like that. I'm not sure, but these things have multiple wings and they've got rod shapes and they fly all over the place. And they're seen down in South and Central America a lot.
Mm-hmm. And lots of good YouTube videos if people want to go check out the rods and see what those are about. Very weird.
And I think another one that's likely to be resolved is your buddy and mine, the Chupi.
Oh, yeah. Chupi sea cabra.
Mm-hmm.
People love to talk about the chupacabra. It definitely was recently characterized to me as a very sexy cryptid, if there is such a thing.
Well, I'm surprised Warner Brothers hasn't grabbed onto it yet and created it as a mate for Wile E. Coyote.
Yeah. What about the thylacine, Scott, the Tasmanian marsupial that is a kind of a carnivore? Do you think those are still out there running around somewhere?
Well, the reports are so consistent that I figure something's got to be out there. And that's a friend from down under, both on the island of Tasmania and on the mainland. So that's another one that could potentially be solved. But frankly, that's the down under version of the Chupi at this point.
Yeah. Wow. So many possibilities. And as we approach the top of the hour, Scott, I just want to remind everyone that you are listening to Epic Voyagers Radio. If you like what you hear, you can definitely check us out on Facebook, Epic Voyagers, EPIC. We also have some excellent YouTube videos up. And of course, thanks again to Ken Cherry and all the good folks at Epic Voyagers for having Scott and I on this evening. We're forging ahead here, though. We've got so many cool things to talk about.
Come on, folks. Yeah, pick up the phone, dial in, give us a question or two, have something to talk about around the campfire or barbecue pit this weekend. I mean, it is July 4th. Let's celebrate our independence.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. We have one regarding food supplies for cryptids, and I guess without getting too technical here, Scott, when you're talking about, for example, an enormous creature living in Loch Ness, which is, I've been there. It's a deep lake, but it's not that big as far as area. What kind of food supply would be needed to support a breeding population of gigantic creatures in that lake?
Well, one of the things that I have a problem with Nessie is it's pretty clear there is not a breeding population in there. If there were, there'd be a hell of a lot more sightings. So whatever's coming into the lake is coming into the lake from outside of it, probably through an underwater access of some kind, and is actually probably coming there to spawn or something like that, like the salmon do. And then they evacuate the lake after they reach a particular size and come back once in a while for some reason. So I suspect that they're actually seagoing, and I'm sure you know that there are underwater caves and underwater access to the ocean from the loch.
Absolutely, and that would explain why they're not seen all the bloody time. Another good question in the chat room here, Scott, from Richard. Richard asks, if you had to convince some open-minded non-believer that Sasquatch exists, what arguments would you use? Which cases would you point to? Convince us, Scott.
That's difficult anymore. My buddy John Johnson is working on a film right now that they're releasing probably in a few days that debunks the PG film. So that leaves me with, I haven't seen the film yet, and I'd like to because I want to see what evidence, if any, they're presenting to discredit the film. Of course, that would probably set Jeff Meldrum back a bit because he's analyzed that thing 9 ways till Sunday and believes that it's genuine. So I don't know. I have tracks that I know are anatomically correct that you'd be hard-pressed to convince me were created as a hoax, considering where these tracks were found.
Right.
I don't think a podiatrist is going to waste their time creating an anatomically correct track and then planting it in the middle of nowhere in the hopes that somebody's going to stumble on it.
Yeah, so, and I guess that's really the best evidence that if I can interject, that we'd point to. That we have the Patterson-Gimlin film, which you mentioned, which, at least my own personal opinion, photographic evidence is just not that compelling, even a film as good as that. So what we're left with are the tracks. And
no, there's one more thing. You brought it up earlier. We have hair samples.
Yes, hair samples, of course.
That have been extracted. I'm one of the 5 people in the world that have come up with anonymous hair samples, or anomalous hair samples that defy DNA description and don't match any known animal. So this is another interesting situation. You've got Adam, who's discovered orangutangic hair.
Adam Davies.
Adam has done that. Wolf Henner Fehrenbach has come up with some from the Pacific Northwest. Then Jeff has come back with some. Jeff Meldrum has come back with some from Canada, as have some other people. And I've come up with swamp ape hair on my expeditions, actually the one you were with me on, Ken, when we collected that bedding material that we thought were in the nests, and we took it back to the lab because, some of the bedding material was Spanish moss. And we took it back to the lab and were able to separate hair from it, which I gave to Discovery Channel producers who took it back to forensic hair specialist Mike Hughes at USC. And Mike came back and said, well, whatever you found, it's a mammal. It's bigger than a bread box, and it's nothing that's known in North America.
Well, that's, it's definitely starting to pile up now. Do you think we'll ever find a body, Scott? And I'm certainly not advocating
so sure
that anyone take a shot at one of these, but would someone maybe find a body that had died of natural causes, or find a bone or something?
I'm not so sure that we haven't. There are some pretty compelling stories around the world of this kind of thing happening, and of course, and Zaina's one of them, and I'm not so sure that the book is closed on that. But a good example is the Ngulu in Central Africa is a Bigfoot-like creature in legend there. And it turns out that animal has been found. It is a primate, and it walks on two legs. It's called the Beely ape. And the remains of that animal sat on a museum shelf in the Congo for 100 years before somebody took another look at them and said, hey, wait a minute, this is not what they thought it was. And then they started looking for it, and Carl Annan and some other people came up and started doing some photographic trap work. Shelley Williams went out there. God bless Shelley. Unfortunately, she was injured in a drive-by shooting and can't do any more work. She lives up in suburban Atlanta. But the animal was eventually captured. They did kill one, which I'm not too thrilled with, but they analyzed the DNA, and they discovered that it's a rare variety of chimpanzee. So it's Pan-troglodyte swinefurthi. And it's a giant chimpanzee that's bigger than a gorilla and walks on two legs, but not habitually.
Wow. That is very cool.
Yeah,
and,
so in fact, a variety of Bigfoot, although the cynics jump all over and say, oh, no, that's not a Bigfoot. Well, I'm sorry, but the Bigfoot legend associated with it, even though it's known by another name, a rose by any other name would still smell as sweet. It was a Bigfoot, and it was discovered, and we have found a Bigfoot. So I'm sorry, folks.
Well, very, very interesting, Scott. And someone else in the chat room was also wondering about the eyewitness accounts. Now, certainly we, as far as I'm concerned, we have to look at the number of eyewitness accounts, which, according to John Green, who's been documenting this for decades, numbers in the thousands now.
Well, yeah, I've got 300 and some odd sightings of the swamp ape since 1947 in my database. So, yeah, I would think so around the United States.
Wow.
But anecdotal evidence, in other words, sighting reports, are not acceptable to science as proof that an animal exists.
Yeah, and understandable. I know science is really about hard physical evidence.